I'm George King from MASECO Private Wealth. We're back doing more of the In Conversation With series. And we have a very special guest today, Jessica McGawley from Dallington. Dallington is a bit like MASECO. You're a very specialist niche provider doing something very important, but not mainstream. So we deal with sort of international families with an American in the mix somewhere, usually American expats, but all sorts of others. You have a similar, very niche focus. So tell our audience a little bit about what you do at Dallington.
I am a psychological consultant, a mediator, and yes, the founder of Dallington. So we've been running Dallington for about 8 years now, and it's a mentoring practice specifically for teenagers and young adults of affluent and successful families. So we run individual mentoring programs and group workshops for siblings and families. Why do they need this, you might say? Well, I shall tell you.
Great.
So let's think a little bit about our blueprint. So if I say your blueprint, the thing that makes you you, that could be your genetics, your environment, your education, your birth order, all of these things. Now, most of us understand that our blueprint has the potential to empower or limit us at certain periods of our life. If you are the child of a successful or affluent parent or family, the general consensus is you have the blueprint. You have the tools, and that the tools
for success.
Exactly.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
And we know that's not always the case.
Right.
There are a lot of opportunities and privileges that come with being this group. At the same time, there are also a lot of challenges that really require a unique lens. They also require some empathy and understanding, and therefore a unique kind of support.
So unsurprisingly, this topic comes up all the time. It is probably the most frequently raised topic when we're advising wealthy families, and mostly parents. It's always, what do I do with my kids? What do I not do with my kids? What do I say? What do I not say? How do I support them but not spoil them? How do I keep them motivated? Just this concept of the juxtaposition of wealth and kids is a primary concern. So, what you do is, I think, critically important, but it's not always clear that people know that they need what you do. So what's your experience with that in terms of people recognizing that what they need is what you do?
Well, it's increasing. I don't think it's always been there because the support hasn't been there, but that's also because the research wasn't there and the awareness wasn't there. There isn't too much empathy for this group, and it's increasing, which is wonderful. But with that increased awareness does come the research and the support and the psychology that is required to support this group. So as you've seen, a lot of family offices, trusts, banks, etc. have things like next generation programs where they try to educate either the parents but also the next gen themselves, as they would call it, on some of these areas. How do they understand their purpose, their motivation, their values, etc. And that's wonderful. It's important that those things happen. But they're all very unique and individual journeys, and actually does require a relationship. It requires a one-to-one, what we would call mentor-mentee relationship.
Fantastic. So let's start to go through this sort of piece by piece, because there is so much there. First, who are we talking about? When we talk about kids, we're not talking about toddlers. What's the age group that you look at? I mean, we frequently will talk to young adults when they hit 18 because they sort of get to make their own decisions, can open accounts. We sometimes talk to them before that in sort of family settings where that makes sense. And of course, we have clients that are in their 60s and 70s, and their kids are full-fledged adults in their own right. So when we're talking about the children of wealthy people, what's the range that we're talking about?
I think that's a really important question. So I'm going to come back to this title of Rising Gen versus Next Gen. So Next Gen, and again, this is different for everybody, but the way that we deem this is that Next Gen really refers to that sort of 30, 40s plus cohort. Rising Gen being that younger demographic. Now, this term was actually coined by Jay Hughes in the States, who some of your listeners may know of, and it really refers to the growing group who are taking on more responsibility in their family, in their community, in the family business maybe, and in their professional lives. So we would say that's around the 16 to 30, teenager coming into young adult, living more independently, and making a lot more of those decisions on their own.
Those people, though, are still engaging with their parents. So the second part of this is, if that's the group we're talking about, are you just talking to them? Are you talking to the parents? Is it the family together? How do you start? when you start to address the issues of that cohort, are you addressing just them or addressing the family? Or
So what we would always say is the family is always in the room.
okay, that's good. All
You
right.
can take that how you want. But the system is always in the room. So always taking that into consideration, as is, I should add, the culture and the family business. Those aspects are always there. As you know yourself as a father, during those teenage, young adult years, whilst you may be the best person, you know them better than anybody, I'm sure, at the same time, they may not want to come to you to talk about certain things. So a lot of this work is about differentiating what is just normal adolescent, young adult behavior, growing pains, versus what sort of stems into within the context of success, affluence, family business.
I think is really key. I mean, there are, kids' stories that we hear about that are disastrous, right? They're really struggling in an educational setting with peers, and it's clear there's an issue. It may not be clear what the solution is, whether it's counseling or something else, whatever, but there are situations where someone's struggling. There are a lot of other situations where it's maybe not so clear, and I think the assessment you were just making is really key. How do people start to recognize that there's a need before something is acute, right? So sort of positive support rather than sort of, disaster intervention.
Yes, you always want that proactive rather than reactive. And frankly, it's much cheaper for everybody.
Yeah,
it's much
versus
better.
lifetime counseling.
If possible. Sometimes it's not possible. Young adults are very good at masking their mental health a lot of the time, as are adults. But ideally, you're proactive. Now, that mentoring journey, I would say that it doesn't matter if you're this group or any group. Anybody who's watching this has hopefully had a mentor of some sort at some time, be that in their career. Maybe it was a family friend, someone that sort of guided them through a growing pain or a transitional phase. Now, if you are, however, the child of this group, you really do have to have that added understanding and empathy for what they might be going through. So I'm sure we've all heard the awful phrase, which is poor little rich kid.
Yeah, right.
Total lack of understanding or empathy for them. I am very against this, as you can imagine, because in my experience, the young adults of affluent families that I've worked with are very humble and very thoughtful. They, if anything, they carry a bit of shame about the fact that they have grown up with such privilege and they're battling with that.
Let's go back to this group we've defined, and I love this term, rising gen instead of next gen. Can we talk about, are there sort of defining characteristics for rising gen of wealthy individuals? Is it different than rising gen in general? So what's the matrix between this age group versus being of wealth, and sort of understanding what are some of the characteristics or challenges or issues, however you want to talk about it, of this cohort?
I think that's totally fair, because actually everybody's rising. If we're growing, we're rising to some degree.
Hopefully, yeah.
Hopefully. So yes, some characteristics are across the board. You don't have to be of wealth to be going through, for example, natural adolescent growing pains, pushing boundaries, having changing relationships with your parents and closer ones with friends and partners, things like that. That's very common. If, however, you are the child of a successful family, parent, multi-generational family, what you're battling with that's maybe more unique is an identity issue around, imagine walking into a room and everybody knows who you are based on your surname and the legacy that's been set before you. Most 17-year-olds don't really have to do that or deal with that. And your identity forming years, those young years where, I don't know about you, but I was a goth for 2 weeks. I was prep for 2 weeks. I got to try on all these different hats. But if you're walking into environments where people have decided that this is your identity based on who your father or mother or grandfather was, that's really tough. And that can lead to different types of behaviors. Another aspect is motivation. So when you are maybe between the ages of 16 to 30 and you're working out, who do I want to be? And that's part of the identity. But it may also come into, where do I want to live and what kind of job do I want? Now, if your parents, again, or the family business that it maybe is so well known and it's not something you're probably ever going to, no matter how hard you work or how much wealth you create yourself, you're probably never going to exceed. Exactly, live up to that. So where do you find the motivation for it? Now, this comes out in two ways that I've seen typically. On one hand, you get what looks like the leaning back teenager, the I don't care, it doesn't matter, not the case. Often very full of anxiety, very full of, where do I go from here? If I can't be as good as them, I'll just sit back and not try as much.
Yeah.
And then you get the other side, which is, right, type A, perfectionism, I'm going to do everything I can to try and exceed that at the cost of perhaps their own health and well-being at times. So you also have that added challenge.
I can imagine. I can sort of see that. Yeah, definitely. So I'm going to say this up front because I know that anyone tuning in is going to be listening for this. So let's just put it on the table. Okay. Inevitably, parents want to say, they want to hear, just tell me what I can and can't do. Give me this list of things to do, things not to do, right? To talk to my kids the right way or what not to say, to engage them at this age in this way, right? What's the blueprint, using that word you used earlier in a different way? But what's the guidebook? Just tell me the right thing to do so I can parent the right way, right? Everyone sort of wants to hear this from the expert. I think I know what your answer is going to be, but I have to put it to you.
Yeah. Okay. Number one, let them fail. Number one, so important. The reason that the parent, whoever's watching, parents are so successful, have done so well, is that I guarantee they've got a good relationship with failure. They've probably failed so many times. And their resilience to failure is really great. They've had to adapt their businesses, they've had to evolve, they've had to make very quick decisions when, the odds are against them. What they do unintentionally, it comes from the best place, is that they sometimes remove those pain points from their children as they're growing up. So they don't want them to feel that sort of pain.
Natural, right?
Absolutely. I don't, none of us want our children to feel pain. But if we think back to our biggest growth moments, would you take it away? It actually helps inform you, it builds that resilience. And so what I get is really successful parents who say, I don't understand why my child has such anxiety, why their driving test is such a big deal. You've got to let them feel the pain. Everything from, for example, getting extra tuition, if they're falling behind in something, there's nothing wrong with that. But actually, maybe they should fail the class. Maybe they shouldn't be in that group. That's okay. Equally, if they spend too much, if they get to their first week of university and they've blown the budget, let them eat baked beans for the rest of the 3 weeks. It doesn't matter that you have the resources to fix it. Don't let them have it. Let them feel the pain. It's so important.
That feels like such a difficult parenting message, to let them feel the pain for any parent, let alone one with means, let alone one that probably has defined part of the reason for their success, to make it easier and better for their kids. So that feels like a very tough love message. How is it received when you give that message?
Something that, I'll say a lot, which is it's really important as the advisor, and this is across, again, family offices, trusts, wealth managers, is that we know our place, which is not in the family home. Now, family therapy, that's a whole other area. It's very important. It has its place. That still does not typically take place in the home. My role is very much about giving the parent the tools to have these conversations around their own kitchen table, and I back off. The parents, the authority figures, the parents are the ones who are the caregivers living with them, and they're the ones who really need to deliver that message. So when it comes to things like boundaries, for example, I've often been asked, can you come in and talk to my family and my children about boundaries with their technology, with money, with experimentation? I said, do you know what I'll do? I will give you the conversation about boundaries. I'll give you the tools, and I want you to have that conversation with them because you're their authority figure, not me. Talk about money. It's really important. It sounds really simple, but it does. But so many families don't talk about money, especially when there's a lot of it.
A bit of a cultural barrier in this country, isn't it?
I think actually in many, it's not just in this country, but yeah, I agree it is a cultural barrier. And it's not just about the money, it's about wealth. What's the difference between, net worth, self-worth? So, if you've grown up with a net worth, and clearly there's a level of comfort and privilege around you, how do you differentiate those two things? Now, the first generation wealth creators will have learned to have developed developed their self-worth with some of that net worth. We can't take away the fact, and that's for everybody, that as your net worth increases, of course, maybe some of your self-worth will increase. We can't really differentiate those two, but you should be able to know who you are and what your value is intrinsically separate of your net worth.
That's a really important topic, actually, and I'd love your perspective on this, what you've seen, given all the conversations, the different types of families you've worked with, because I can imagine, on the one hand, that the wealth creator maybe has more of a higher likelihood that they associate the net worth and the self-worth because they're creating it and they're sort of linked together in more sort of obvious ways. Whereas the potential inheritor, whether it's next generation or several generations down or what have you, I can imagine that there is maybe a less obvious connection between that which clearly wasn't theirs, they were just born into it, and themselves. So are you finding in your conversations, in sort of just non-scientific, I know, but are you finding that people don't understand how to define self-worth because they come from high net worth, or that they are actually truly conflating the two, saying my value is the family money?
Well, I'm not going to answer that directly. I'm going
That's
to go
fine.
around.
You go where you want.
I'm going to answer that is, with parents, I'm sure, when you work with your clients, if they lost everything tomorrow, they would do it again. It is about the build. It's about the climb.
Okay.
The top of the mountain isn't anything without the climb. Keep saying that. That's the feeling of progress is what the parents, typically in my experience, that's what they're reaching for. The wealth is absolutely a very important byproduct of that, but it is the progress. That's what they hunt for. Whereas the child is brought up with that byproduct, so they don't know what the difference is. So how do you create that? How do you have those conversations? Well, again, I'm always going to come back to this. It's about getting around that kitchen table. It's about having, again, re-empowering the parents to have those conversations around a table, which is, what is our values? What do we care about, irrespective of this wealth? What matters to us and what brings us and unites us together?
Right. So the idea of letting kids fail, I think, is maybe hard to do, but sort of easy to understand. The idea of talking about money is sort of easy to understand, but I'm curious if people feel like they are capable of that, right? Having the right language, having the right context to actually have those kind of conversations in an effective way. Is that something that, parents can do?
Well, it depends on their relationship with money.
Okay.
So to come back to your earlier point, yes, I think there is that cultural aspect, which is, in England, if we don't talk about money, then it may feel really uncomfortable to have a conversation about money, but it doesn't mean it shouldn't happen. Sex is an uncomfortable conversation for people to have, still should happen, So I would look at it like that, especially during those boundary testing years, which is if you are starting to become more independent with your use of money and how you look at money, if you're not that comfortable with it, get someone to advise you. Get someone to advise you on how to introduce these topics, but then deliver it yourself if possible. Bring it back into the home around the table.
And it's actually useful to hear you say that, because it does trigger memories that I have as a wealth advisor where clients have actually said that. They said, look, I would love can you help me with this? They don't really know what they're asking for specifically. They're like, can you help talk to my young adult kids about this? We don't have a structured program like some of the big banks where they put them in some 2-day program or send them off to some Swiss lake or something. But even without that clarity, there is clearly a need. And we do get the request to say, look, I'm trying to help figure out how to do that. You're my wealth advisor. I have money conversations with you about my wealth. Can we start to incorporate that with the kids? So that's true. There is a reach out that we see from parents to help them with some of that.
I think I would always be really curious when a parent comes to you and has that conversation, which is, what are they really asking? Do they want, a curriculum, a module of, this is our net worth and this is how much money we've got in the bank, in estate, in, property, etc. And this is how it works. Are they asking for that? Or are they asking for you to help them have a conversation where they explain why they're creating wealth, why they continue to create wealth, even though they are very comfortable? That's a whole different question. So I would always try to bring curiosity into those conversations.
I like that.
The other, only other aspect that I think is really important is education, which is, it sounds silly. I mean, most of my clients are some of the most educated, they've got the best schooling, degrees, masters, you name it, they've done it. When it comes to an education of the self and an educational understanding of how you see the world and how the world sees you, which is also important. If you are from this very small group, the world definitely sees you in a certain way. It's not always positive. It's important to understand that. What is the perception of privilege? So having those conversations at Dallington, we run a curriculum, a 47 module curriculum actually, that's been developed over these sorts of conversations. But, have those conversations about what it looks like.
Not to put you on the spot, and people can look it up online, but what are some of the topics that you cover in those modules as you're having those conversations?
Absolutely. So it really ranges. We always say it's so important to always address the practical and the personal. If you think of progress as being 80% psychological, 20% action, so really understanding, why we do the things we do, why we don't do the things we do, and then taking action. I should caveat that by saying I'm also a big believer in just taking action, and if it goes wrong, that's fine. You can still learn from it, But therefore, our whole curriculum is really set up on 80% psychology, understanding who you are, and that's everything from understanding your values. How do your values differ to your families and your family businesses? What are your greatest fears? Understanding your family. My favorite module is when I get a young adult to draw their family. Some will draw... Well, I don't give them instructions. So you start by saying, draw the family, and some will go, you've got mum, dad, yes. Others will draw a sinking ship. Others will draw, stigmen. So, and then you can have a conversation about it. At the other end, we have things like the psychology of money, the perception of privilege, some basic financial education. What are the things you should really know if this is what you're going into? And other aspects being things like beneficiary education. Now, I'm not interested in your trust. I am interested in how you learn to speak with your financial advisors, though. Now, I say that, and I'm speaking to a financial advisor, I say that because so often young adults, the rising gen, are given a financial advisor. Their parent has had the opportunity and privilege to choose one. To go through, meet all the different people, understand why I've chosen George over somebody else, But their child might just be, this is who you're going to meet. And it may not be the right fit. As we know, a good relationship is a match. And we have to really think about that.
That's funny because that, of course, is one of the big fears that has been sort of hanging over this industry for a long time, is this general acknowledgement of this massive wealth transfer that I guess is underway, but it's going to be happening for some period of time. And exactly this issue that, it may not be the case that the inheriting generation, the inheriting people, whether it's gender or age, are going to want to have the same advisors. So that topic is obviously very live across the industry. And I think part of what we all need to do as enlightened, forward-looking advisors is not wait for that, but anticipate that and initiate those conversations. And you're right, if it's not a good match, acknowledge that. But I think if we shift our ability to have these kind of conversations, we can ensure it is a good match because we're actually engaging not just with the parents, but with whoever going to be inheriting the wealth. So that's a good shout.
Well, I really agree. And I really, it's great to hear you say that because actually, as we always say, number one is awareness. Just going, this is going to be a challenge. And let's look at ourselves as an organization because organizational change does not happen overnight. It takes a long time. So how are you going to support your relationship managers to have those sorts of conversations with a now, let's say, 16-year-old who, before we know it, is going to take a seat at the table? What do they need to know about what matters to them? When it comes to investments, ESG shouldn't be, it's the standard, and philanthropy, all of those things. The younger generation that I work with, they will be able to tell by looking at a wealth advisor's website whether or not this is just a nice front or whether they really mean it.
Yeah, if it's authentic.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it really matters. And they will ask, and they should. And, that's something to commend, actually.
One of the things we get asked all the time in this general sort of topic area is there a podcast I can listen to? Is there a book you can recommend? There's a general recognition that there's tons of stuff out there that no one has any idea what's good, what's not good, what's effective, what they should actually consume in some way. So the curveball question I have for you, and you can just punt if you'd like, but is, first of all, is that a viable route for this? Is that a potentially valuable resource for people, podcasts and books and so forth, for parents or kids or both, maybe different sets? Or, is that something that is no substitute for the types of live engagement you're talking about, either within the family and those family conversations or with advisors, whether it's specialist advisors like you or wealth advisors like us? How do you see those types of external resources, both the plethora of them and how to find them and, utilizing them in this process?
So I am very pro as much information and awareness as possible. The way I see it is that more people in this space and in this industry, it gives credence to the work. I'm not trying to take it for myself by any means. There are so many young people and families who actually really do need this support internationally, and therefore more people in this space actually gives it more validity, more research will come into it. So I'm very pro anybody coming into it. There are absolutely some sort of more top players, as you might call them, who people should think about. So there's a book called The Quest for Legitimacy. That's a brilliant book, and I would really recommend it. It's about more specifically about young adults from prominent families. So you don't need to necessarily be affluent, but there is prominence. So that's status and living in the shadow of a giant, as Jamie calls it. Then in terms of podcasts, I'm not au fait with any podcasts. Maybe this is starting one. This will be this one. There are definitely lots of books. There are also just more researchers. Even within my team, Farah Kashabi, she's going to be the youngest doctor in the world in a few months on identity formation of young adults of affluent families. So, that wasn't even a thing 10 years ago. The fact that somebody is being encouraged to write a doctorate and write a thesis on this, is so impressive. Yeah. The group that we're talking about are so used to having advisors. They are used to having advisors for everything from tax, legal, financial, home, relocation, education, you name it. That actually it makes sense to have advice and a relationship that's trusted in this way. And that they should find the right person to have those conversations with. That doesn't mean to say that reading online and getting books and listening to podcasts, if they can find them, isn't helpful. But they're black and white. They're not going to give you, there's not going to be that grey area that a consultant or an advisor or a psychologist is going to give you. And I will always come back to this word, which is the curiosity. Got to bring curiosity back into these conversations, which is why are we asking them? What's the wealth really doing?
I like that a lot.